Today, we're talking about writing. Maybe I should be more specific. I spend a lot of time on this channel trying to figure out what separates bad stories from good ones. Why a reader would respond to one plot and not another. Why one story engages on an emotional level and another doesn't. And what I've discovered is that those are incredibly difficult questions to answer, and the answers to them are highly subjective. Sure, the books that exist that are largely considered to be good probably resonate with a large group of people, which is why these books end up as bestsellers. But you will still have parts of the demographic who don't like a book or don't find it engaging. Any measure of the quality of a piece of writing is going to be a discussion about averages. So coming up with a comprehensive list of what makes a good story is quite challenging. One might say impossible. But I need something to make a video of this week, so here goes. I want to talk about what are, in my opinion, the crucial elements of a good story. The things that you absolutely need to have if you have any chance of your story being well received. Now, we're talking about this at the plot/story level, not the prose level. I have read a lot of stories with very good prose that still weren't very interesting at a plot level. And I've read a lot of stories that likely had a lot of potential at the plot level, but they were marred by having bland, uninteresting, or disjointed prose. Prose has an effect, but that's not what we're talking about today. This list is by no means exhaustive, and it's not meant to be. You can file this video in the opinion section of wherever. Anyway, first up in the list of things that good stories contain, elements that the reader can sympathize or empathize with. This might be something to do with the setting, a particular trait or situation of a character, or something about the conflict in the story. You need an element that the reader can identify with, something that matches their own life experience. And no, not every character you write needs to be an insurance salesman from Pittsburgh in order for the reader to relate. You don't need to match every element of a reader's life, you just need a couple of things that they can relate to. This is why romance plots are so ubiquitous, even in very fantastical settings, or why coming-of-age stories or stories about grief and loss happen across so many different genres. It's why young adult fiction mostly features characters who are young adult age, why middle grade features characters who are middle grade age. It's because the target reader for those genres is more likely to connect and sympathize and identify with someone who is similar to them in age. Understanding what's at stake for a character, what they have to lose and what they have to gain, and why that's important is important. And the most efficient way to do that is to connect with something likely to be in the reader's experience. This is also a reason that not everybody will connect with a given story. If the story doesn't touch on something that is relevant to them or something that they have experience with, then they might not connect with it. Time for the next thing on this list of things that good stories usually contain: time. I've mentioned before that you can take any story, even a really long one, and condense it down to maybe a paragraph and still basically get across what happened. This will, however, almost universally ruin the story. It will strip away all of the emotional impact and any chance that the reader has to connect with the plot. So why is that? I don't know what empirical evidence exists to support this, but my understanding is that in its normal state, the human brain is not wired to do creative things. We generally go through life being very task-oriented. It's only when we slow down and engage the brain in creative thinking that our thought processes begin to change, and we become more open to exploring new ideas and being creative. And that's what I think good fiction does. It gets the reader into that mode of thinking, gets the suspension of disbelief working, and allows them to feel things about places and people who aren't real. When you think about it, fiction is a weird thing to invest time in. We know that these people and stories aren't real, yet we still spend time with them and let ourselves get emotionally invested in them. It takes time to get the reader into this state, and this is why boiling down stories tends to take away some of their flavor. It's a double whammy of not using the sort of language that allows the reader to get into a state where they can become more emotionally engaged, and also not keeping them for enough time for that to happen. If you hadn't noticed, the discussion we just had was a show versus tell discussion. You were probably expecting me to mention that at least once. Which is ironic because the next thing on the list is expectations. I'm going to say something that I expect you're not going to like. The best stories are usually predictable. Readers throughout the course of a story develop, either consciously or not, a list of outcomes that they want to see. Whether it's what characters they'd like removed, who they'd like to become king, what team they'd like to win the tournament, what characters they'd like to end up together. Setting up elements of the story that the reader can have expectations about and fulfilling those expectations is critical. This also relates back to time, since having time pass between the introduction of a conflict and its resolution allows for tension to build and for the reader to become more involved in the outcome. Twists are a special consideration, and it might seem that any story that ends with a major twist violates the whole expectation thing. But I would argue that the best twists are ones that are well foreshadowed. The reader might not be consciously expecting what happens, but when the twist does happen, it feels right. There's a phrase, surprising but inevitable, that applies here. Mainly because this is what that phrase is referring to. Even in cases where there isn't a twist, there is usually an expectation. This escalation usually comes in the form of the conflict getting bigger or the rewards for the character becoming greater. And the purpose is to not only meet but exceed the expectations that the reader has. Most of this relates to the elements that the reader initially sympathized with or identified with at the beginning of the story that allowed them to become emotionally invested. And then once enough time passes to build up expectations, then they can reach the end of the story and hopefully those expectations are satisfied. Good foreshadowing puts most of the pieces in place, and then when the resolution to the story comes, the reader sees the picture in full detail. Just like you watch this video in full detail, assuming you didn't just skip around and stuff. So there you have it. That was kind of a bit of a wandering video, but I think these are interesting ideas to explore. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos every Wednesday and occasionally on Friday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.